Today we're taking a look at a video called God's Amazing Creations, Proof that God is Real, the Bumblebee. Now I have to say, I think these people seem genuinely nice. They probably believe everything they're saying here and aren't really aware of any of the things I'm going to bring up, so I'll go a bit easy here.
We are going to prove that God exists through a bumblebee.
No!
Yes.
Really though? A bumblebee?
A bumblebee.
Well, ain't that a heck of a thing?
In all my years, I have never ever heard of this.
I also have never ever heard of someone trying to prove God with a bumblebee, except all the apologetics that do that. Other than that, though, never.
And I bet $1. Let's put $1.
Don't go too crazy now. You don't want to bankrupt yourself on gambling. Let's make it a nickel.
That you guys have never heard of this either.
So is this a bet of $1 with every individual person watching the video? Because your video is watched by several hundred people. You could lose perhaps even up to tens of dollars doing this. So again, like I said, be careful. Now, if it turns out that I have heard of this thing that you're going to talk about, what do I have to do to claim my money? Do I have to sign an affidavit and send it to you? I'm really not much of a gambler. I don't know how these things work. Please advise.
Did you know that...
If I could just pause you right here for a moment, I want to comment on your background. I really like it. You got this classic shaded lamp, none of this depressing modern stuff, nice atmospheric lighting. You got a shelf, and for some reason you have like a wobbly cross vibrating off of the shelf. Makes it feel like reality is slightly off. It's very, what's the word? Oniric. I do feel like the fact that the wall is just sort of a bland white expanse is a little lacking, but fortunately you guys fill in the negative space. Pop in a nice range hood and a potted plant and you're done.
Roughly 8% of the flowers.
All the flowers.
All the flowers.
Do you mean all the flowers as in 100% of the flowers, or do you mean all the flowers as in 8% of all the flowers?
All the flowers?
All the flowers.
Okay, so all the flowers.
Okay, all the flowers. 100% of the flowers.
Have their pollen so tightly, I don't know how you'd say it. Wraps in the flower, right?
Yeah.
That's the way to put it, I guess, yeah. We'll talk about this later. You haven't even explained what you're talking about yet.
That the pollen is only released at a certain frequency.
Okay, that I don't think is very accurate. It is a common idea about this process. It's a very intuitive thought, and some of the terminology doesn't really help with that, but it doesn't really seem to be how it usually works. But again, we'll talk about this more in a bit.
Which is just amazing. Okay,
Yeah.
So the normal honeybee cannot create this frequency of a tone. So we're talking like a C note or a D note.
Right.
Create this frequency to release the pollen.
Okay, so you're talking about this as if the bee is producing an auditory note, and it's that sound that's making the pollen come out of the anther, which is the part of the stamen that contains the pollen. Now, in the research surrounding buzz pollination, a name that comes up over and over again is Mario Vallejo Marin, who I'll just refer to as Mario from now on for simplicity. This guy seems to have been very, very involved in recent research into the topic. In this article published in New Phytologist in 2019, he points out, although it was previously suggested that pollen release was the result of the combined effects of acoustic turbulence and anther vibrations, and then there's a reference to a paper from 1968, our current understanding suggests that sound is a byproduct of the bee's vibrations, which do not contribute to pollen extraction. The vibrations produced by the thoracic muscles are transmitted to the flower via direct physical contact of the bee's body, including the head. Bees usually bite the anthers while vibrating, thorax, abdomen, and to a lesser extent the legs. Sonication, applying sound to agitate particles, therefore, may be a misleading term when used in the context of pollen extraction, and it may be best to use floral vibrations, or vibrations on flowers. And he points that out because sonication is a term that's sometimes used for this. So the reason I bring that up is that you're trying to draw this analogy with musical notes. It's not entirely clear to me, even from the rest of the video, how exactly you think this process works, but I want to be clear that it's not a process of the bee landing on the flower and essentially making music to make the flower open up and release the pollen. What actually happens is that the bee grabs onto part of the flower with its mouth and then shakes its body hard to try to get the stuff to fall out. You can see that in the video we're looking at here. When you observe the bee, you will hear a tone caused by its movement, but that doesn't mean the tone itself is what's releasing the pollen. Now, as for the honeybees can't do it thing, you're right, honeybees do not do buzz pollination. Only about 50 to 60% of bee species do. In this quick guide written for Current Biology by David J. Pritchard and Mario again, it says buzz pollination is relatively widespread. Flowers with buzz-specialized morphology are found across more than 20,000 species of flowering plants, including economically important crop species such as tomatoes, potatoes, and kiwis, while flower buzzing has been observed in 74 genera comprising about 58% of bee species. But that does not include the honeybees, so when people try to have honeybees as their exclusive pollinator, but they're trying to grow buzz-pollinated crops, they tend to have pretty bad results. There might be some pollination, but it's highly ineffective. They say only about half of bee species can buzz flowers, including large carpenter bees as well as minute sweat bees. We do not currently know why some species do not buzz flowers. On a mechanistic level, some bees might not be able to generate the forces required to release pollen, and so there is little point in buzzing flowers. Bumblebees and carpenter bees can produce buzzes with acceleration sufficient to release pollen from poricidal anthers, but honeybees cannot reach the required acceleration. So basically, not much of an answer other than just honeybees don't do it. But you'll notice that they don't even mention frequency there. It's not that the honeybees sing at the wrong frequency. The issue they refer to is the ability or lack thereof to generate sufficient acceleration force, which is very, very different, and that's important. Now, a couple things I'll just cover here while we're talking about how frequent it is and what it is. The lady there said all the flowers. That's not correct. Guy, you were roughly correct in terms of species. You said it was 8% or so, and that's the right general range. Plus or minus like a couple of percent. These things are obviously fuzzy. And what it is you have the pollen stored in this long thing with a little opening at the end, and it just has to be shaken to make that fall out. Like a pepper shaker, except it helps to vibrate it pretty fast and aggressively.
Only the bumblebee creates a frequency, which is what? It's
a note C.
And the note C.
Yeah.
Well, no, I'm afraid not. That sounds a little bit too good to be true, doesn't it? And I'm afraid that's because it is. Here in the Botanical Journal of the Linnaean Society 2021 by Nunez et al., including, again, Mario. Seriously, he shows up everywhere. It says, pollen release from poricidal stamens is a function of the vibration characteristics, mainly its amplitude. The amplitude of a floral vibration depends on the characteristics of the bee, the coupling between bee and flower, and the vibrational properties of the stamen, anther and filament. Now, amplitude is not the note. A loud C and a quiet C are both still a C. The amplitude of the vibration refers to how hard it is. But what's being asserted here in the video is that the primary relevant factor for extracting pollen from the stamen is the stamen's natural frequency, which is what this article is about. As they point out, in principle, if the vibrations applied by bees occurred at the natural frequency of stamens, vibration amplitude would increase through resonance, resulting in higher pollen removal. But this is in principle. They point out some other things, such as previous work on the spectral properties of buzz pollination has established that the fundamental frequency of bee vibrations on flowers varies across bee species and ranges from about 100 to 400 Hz, with significant variation within and among bee taxa. And experimental studies with captive bumblebees have not found large changes in buzz frequency when the same bee species visits different flower species, or when bees are trained in artificial flowers that release pollen at different specific frequencies. Regardless of whether bees can adjust their vibration frequency to match the flowers that they visit, it is unclear whether the frequencies of floral vibrations caused by bees overlap the natural frequencies of stamens. In other words, there are lots of different bees that do buzz pollination. There are lots of different flowers that could be buzz pollinated. One species of bee will pollinate multiple different species of flowers with multiple different natural frequencies on their stamens, without seeming to change their buzz frequency. They say to date, little is known about the natural frequencies of stamens of buzz-pollinated plants. A pioneer study by King and Buchmann found that the natural frequencies of stamens of so-and-so was significantly lower, 124 Hz, than the fundamental frequencies of bees buzzing these flowers, 316 Hz. Now, I'll pause here and point out that 316 Hz is not middle C. Middle C is about 262 Hz. 316 is more like a somewhat sharper D sharp. And I'll also mention the little quick guide we looked at before points out that floral vibration frequencies can exceed 300 Hz, with some species approaching 400 Hz, which, putting it into the language of musical notes, is approaching F or even G. Later, they point out if stamen resonance at the natural frequencies is within the reach of at least some bee species, the question arises as to whether bees exploit this resonance effect during buzz pollination. Empirical work with bumblebees suggests that this is not the case. Our bumblebee experiment suggests that B. terrestris do not rapidly match their floral buzzes to the natural frequency of the flowers they visit. In other words, despite the natural frequency of the stamen in question, the bumblebee isn't bothering, really. Our results are consistent with previous work on bumblebees that also showed a lack of frequency adjustment to match specific vibrations in bees visiting different types of mechanical flowers that released pollen when buzzed at specific frequencies. They talk a little bit about the bees altering their vibrational frequency as a result of experience, because they have been observed to slightly reduce their buzz frequency with experience. And because the natural frequency of the stamen is lower than the bee's frequency, this could be taken as the bee gaining experience, getting better at the job, realizing that if it buzzes closer to the natural frequency of the stamen, the results are better. But the variation is so low, it appears to be such a minor adjustment, despite the fact that the bees clearly are capable of producing lower frequencies in other contexts, that this doesn't really seem that compelling. And they say the behavioral mechanism that would allow a bumblebee to associate the production of a particular buzz frequency with an increase in pollen release is unclear. Perhaps inexperienced bees initially produce buzzes of variable frequencies and over time learn to associate particular frequencies with increased pollen release due to resonance, but the elegant experiment of Switzer et al. 2019 with mechanical flowers provided no evidence of this type of instrumental learning. Alternatively, producing vibrations at the resonant frequency of stamens might have a relatively small effect on pollen release compared to the effect of other components of the bee's buzz, such as amplitude and the duration and number of buzzes. Experiments applying bee-like vibrations of different characteristics show that pollen release is more strongly determined by vibration amplitude, peak velocity, than by frequency in S. rostratum. Vibrations of both low frequency and high acceleration may not be possible to reach by bees if their maximum displacement is reached, e.g. due to the limits imposed by thoracic size. If the gain in increased pollen release that would be achieved through stamen resonance is offset by a decrease in pollen release due to producing vibrations of lower amplitude, then bees might not benefit from matching their relatively lower natural frequency of flowers. Instead, the optimal frequency of the floral vibrations by a bee to maximize pollen release may be best explained by the resonance properties of the body of the bee. Buzz-pollinating bees may benefit from vibrating at the resonance frequency of their own bodies, which would produce the highest amplitude vibration for a given input of energy. And so again, we come back to the most relevant thing here being amplitude, not the natural frequency of the stamen. In other words, you just gotta shake it hard. You're not really interested in playing it like a musical instrument. This may apply in other species too. Ladies, take note. Now, the funny thing is, you're talking about the bumblebee as the one that uses this technique, but the conclusion of this article is something very different. For large bees, such as bumblebees, that can reach amplitudes high enough to elicit pollen release, stamen natural frequency may not be the most important determinant of the type of vibrations they produce. However, exploiting the vibrational properties of stamens may be advantageous for other bees, unable to reach the required acceleration amplitudes to elicit pollen release due to small size, low mass, or other biomechanical constraints. For these smaller bees, the increase in vibration amplitude potentially achieved through resonance of stamens might allow them to utilize flowers that would otherwise be beyond their vibrational reach. And then they say further work should compare the stamen natural frequency of other buzz-pollinated flowers with buzzing frequencies of a broader community of visiting bees to establish whether any bee exploits floral resonance for pollen release. So this is far from an established fact of how this works. In fact, in the case of bumblebees, it seems pretty definitive that that's just not how it works at all. The question is, if it's such an interesting idea and it's in the realm of possibility, is this used anywhere by any bee? Which seems to be unknown. Back to the New Phytologist article by Mario himself, vibrations and their effect on pollen release. We are still in the early stages of understanding the mechanism by which floral vibrations result in pollen ejection. Theoretically, the acceleration of the anther tip during vibrations should create centrifugal forces on the pollen grains, causing them to be expelled out of the apical pore. In Buchmann and Hurley's model, pollen is expelled as a result of the kinetic energy transmitted from the internal walls of the vibrating anther and the pollen grains through elastic collisions. Here, pollen ejection is a function of anther geometry and the frequency and amplitude velocity of the vibrations experienced by the anther. In addition to these mechanical effects, it has been suggested that electrostatic interactions between the pollen grains and the anther walls may also play a significant role in expelling pollen from the anthers, but there is no direct evidence for this yet. Although we still lack a full model of pollen release in vibrating anthers, in principle the accumulation of kinetic energy, centrifugal forces, and perhaps electrostatic interactions could jointly contribute to the expulsion of pollen grains following bee vibrations. Empirical studies suggest that the characteristics of the vibrations applied to the anthers affect pollen release. Now, you're not going to like this, video creators. Artificial vibrations between 450 and 1000 hertz remove twice as much pollen than vibrations of 400 hertz. However, within the range of frequencies produced by some bumblebees, 240 to 405 hertz, which is, again, to put it in musical terms, between a somewhat flat B and a pretty sharp G, frequency has a modest effect on pollen release. In contrast, peak velocity amplitude and duration have a much stronger positive effect on pollen release during artificial vibrations. Intriguingly, a recent playback study found that amplitude, measured as acceleration, velocity, or displacement, is positively associated with pollen release in Solanum lycopersicum, but the relationship of pollen release with frequency depended on whether the amplitude of the vibration was included as a covariate as velocity amplitude, positive association, or acceleration amplitude, negative association. These results indicate that pollen release is jointly influenced by multiple characteristics of the vibration, and that studying one variable in isolation, e.g. frequency, may not be sufficient to describe the force being transmitted to the anther and its effect on pollen release. Now, I know that's a lot, but I'm pretty much done with that aspect of this video now. The point of all of that is just to say, look, you seem to think that you found this instance of beautiful simplicity within the natural world. It's this almost magical event where the bee shows up, plays a little tune on its wings or whatever, and the flower opens up and delivers out its pollen in response. It sounds like one of those things you would read online, like on BuzzFeed, or maybe in one of those awful, supposedly educational books for children, which as a father I can tell you, many of those books oversimplify things or try to make things more interesting in a much too extreme way that results in them just being incorrect. What I presented here might not be as beautiful and exciting, but it's closer to the reality of most of the natural world, in that it's messy and inconsistent and complicated, and doesn't always make for a nice clear soundbite.
The bumblebee creates a frequency, which is what? It's
a note C.
And the note C,
Yeah.
that when he goes into the flower...
The males don't collect pollen, they don't buzz pollinate.
When he goes into the flower...
Well, the bee doesn't really go in the flower. The anthers are sticking out of the flower, so the bee just kind of is on the flower.
And his bzzz will create... Did you like my little bzzz?
I did too. It was wonderful. Improves the entertainment value of my video by at least like 5 to 10%.
Will create this frequency,
Yeah.
and the flower releases its pollen.
I feel like you've left out a fair amount of the process there in your explanation, but to be honest, my interpretation of the situation is that she's the one who knows about this. It seems to me like she's probably the one who brought this to you. That's why you keep looking at her to tell you if you're getting it right. In which case, I feel like she should be the one telling us about it. But then again, Guy, Jim, according to your YouTube channel's About page, you're an ex-pastor, so maybe you're just more comfortable with this kind of speaking or something. I'm not really criticizing the format or anything. I'm just trying to understand why it is how it is, that's all.
It just like flutters out. And this is really fascinating because why wouldn't we let the flower release its pollen?
Right.
Except only for the bumblebee.
From the bumblebee, right.
You know?
Well, it's not like the flower releases it specifically for the bumblebee. The bumblebee might be able to do a better job than some other bees, to be sure, because bumblebees are big, and they can shake that thing around with a really high amplitude. They have a lot of weight and power to put behind this. But yeah, as I said, over half of bee species buzz pollinate. This is not specific to this one type of bee, and this one type of bee is not specific to one type of flower. It's a lot of different kinds of flowers, as you said. You know, Guy, you said it was 8%. Lady, you said it was all the flowers. Whichever it is, that's a lot of different flower species, with a lot of different types of stamens, with a lot of different natural frequencies. And the bumblebee I wouldn't think is going to be dealing with all of these flowers, but definitely a wide variety. This alone really should be enough to tell you that your basic idea about this might be flawed. And while I'm thinking about it, I do want to read one other quote that I found interesting. I know I said I was done, but while foraging on a flower, bees can modify their buzzes based on how much pollen they are extracting. When a flower does not release pollen, bees may change the properties of their buzz, increasing the frequency or amplitude. Evidence for bees learning to produce buzzes with particular properties is mixed. Although bees seem to get better at buzzing flowers, collecting more pollen with experience, we are not sure why this is. Different studies have found changes in the frequency, duration, and amplitude of buzzes as bees gain experience, but attempts to train bees to buzz at higher or lower frequencies showed no signs of bees learning the best frequency. Instead, bees continue to use the same heuristics they would use in other situations, increasing their buzzing frequency when flowers are not rewarding them with pollen. In other words, land on the flower, grab it with your mouth, buzz it like hell, and if it doesn't work, buzz it faster and harder, until hopefully the stuff eventually falls out. The human might see a lot of nuance to this, a lot of room for improvement, certain ways to modify the technique to maximize results, but from the bee's perspective, it seems much simpler. You ever shake a pepper shaker and the holes are a little bit too small and the pepper doesn't come out? And so you start shaking it harder and you start shaking it faster. And you're like, damn it, I want my pepper. This is taking all day. Yeah.
He's kind of quirky that way.
He's kind of like, it's like just when you, to me, it's almost like when you think you got God figured out. If you're a person that doesn't believe in God, you think you got God figured out. He's not that complex.
And then you read some oversimplified article on the internet about how bees shake parts of flowers to get pollen out. And then you think God is more complex than you thought he was. I'm not sure I understand the thinking.
And when you hear something like this, and to me, evolution, come on, let's be honest. Evolution, did it go from an A note to a B note to a C note? Then
Oh no.
Finally, through evolution, it hits the right note to release this flower.
No, even if the bumblebee used a C note to get the pollen out, no, obviously not. That's not how evolution works. Why would it start with an A note and go to a B note and then a C note? I don't understand what you think evolution is, and I'm not sure I want to understand. I can tell that statement sits on a big, tangled mess of thinking that I don't think I want to even touch.
There's two things involved. So is the bee that smart to know, okay, I got to buzz faster, or create a bigger frequency to release that?
Well, that wouldn't require the bee to be very smart, would it? If the bee lands on the flower and starts kind of vibrating at, whatever frequency, at 150, 200 hertz, something like that, and then just gradually increases until the stuff falls out, that doesn't exactly require a high intelligence. And in a sense, as I read, that sort of is what happens. The bee will land and grab on and start vibrating the thing, and if the stuff doesn't come out, it'll just do it harder. It's not like it's aware of how it's supposed to do it. It's not like it knows anything about the flower. It doesn't know anything about amplitude or frequency. Grab and shake. If it doesn't work, shake more. Do you think bees don't have this level of ability? Do you think evolution proposes they shouldn't? I don't really understand what the point is supposed to be.
He goes up to the flower and he doesn't see that, I'm not getting the pollen, so he beats faster.
Well, yeah, they're there to eat and collect pollen. Of course, if it's not working, they're going to change technique slightly. These are animals. These aren't some kind of brainless thing capable of acting one way and one way only. Where are you getting the idea that they should be? These things fly around. They can figure out how to flap faster or slower or in different ways in that context. On the fly, no pun intended. So why not when they're sitting on a flower? The idea that they wouldn't be able to do this makes no sense based on what a bee is.
Come on, right?
Good.
A bee is a bee. It just does its job.
Right.
That's just buzzes, right?
Really? I don't think you know anything about bees. In fact, I'm offended now on the bees' behalf. I think you should take that back.
I've seen bees, they'll go into a flower and there's nothing there. You can tell, so they just boom, 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 boom.
Yeah, obviously the nectar or the pollen in a flower can get used up, especially if there's high competition in an area. And the bee will land there and go, no luck, and leave. How does this square with what you just said about the bee not being able to make any kind of decisions? It just does its job and goes buzz. In that case, it would do the exact same thing on every single flower, regardless of anything. Why slander the poor bees like this if you're going to contradict the slander 2 seconds later?
They don't go up to the flower and think about what frequency that I need to create to release this pollen, because this just looks like one of those flowers that's a bee frequency.
Yeah, well, again, as I covered, that's not really how it works. But even if it did depend on a specific frequency, that's not really that different from it depending on amplitude or duration. Just go through a range of options, and once you get to one that seems to be working, then stick with that. Isn't this like the most basic of animal behavior? But so you're talking about this in relation to evolution. The assertion is that now all flowers are C-note flowers, and the bee has to land and play a C-note. But the problem, from your perspective, apparently, as far as I can tell, is that for some reason you think you had to start from a lower note and work up to a C-note, like evolutionarily. A, B, C, and before A, presumably, I don't know, maybe there is no note before that because the alphabet starts at A. Who knows? But so when there were flowers of multiple required frequencies, the bees would have been confused and would have had to look at the flower and figure out what frequency was required based on analysis of the appearance of the anthers or something. And then, I don't know, evolve immediately into a bee frequency bee. But that's not possible because bees only buzz. They don't make decisions, they don't try different options, they would never try to vibrate the anther at a different frequency, which I guess must mean that any given bee species only has one particular frequency that it vibrates at, right? So the question is, if the flower requires a particular vibration and the bee requires a particular vibration, how could they ever match up through progressive evolution? Is that the question? Maybe? You're not very clear. I'm kind of making this up to try to make you have some sort of a point. And if that is something like your point, then it brings us to a concept that is relevant to the real-world version of these events as well as your fantasy, which is the concept of coevolution. And that's something that is not a challenge for evolution. In fact, it's kind of a classic concept in evolutionary thinking. Think of, for example, the moth that Darwin talked about in the fertilization of orchids. There was an orchid with an extremely long nectary, and so Darwin predicted that there must be some insect with an extremely long proboscis to be able to suck the nectar out, which was then discovered over 40 years later. And this, you may be amazed to find out, was not treated as a crisis for evolution, nor has it been any other time it's been noticed. Explaining this kind of thing is kind of evolution's bread and butter. I'm not going to go much into the concept of coevolution here, but suffice it to say that to proclaim that this is something that's completely incompatible with evolution is to show that just as you're completely ignorant about bees, you're apparently also completely ignorant about what evolution is proposed to be and how it's proposed to work. Sometimes it's worth learning anything. Making scrunchy faces and laughing isn't an argument. Take that effort and put it into trying to make an argument next time so I don't have to try to cobble one together for you.
So I'm going to read to you what kind of flower this actually is.
Okay, yeah, let's give us some more. Let's go in depth in this.
If you go to the depth of a puddle, I will be amazed.
A couple of
Pretty
flowers.
fascinating. Sorry, I keep interrupting you.
Yeah, man. Shut up. You are kind of getting on my nerves. I would much rather hear her talk. I like her better.
Keep talking over me. I will proceed anyways.
Just elbow him next time. Works on me.
All right.
Okay, go for it.
This is a book written by two scientists, by the way. And they've done extensive research on this. It's really interesting.
Okay, but really, these are smart people.
Yeah.
That's part of what she meant to imply, I think, yes. I think the more relevant point, though, is what she said. They've done extensive research, which if the research is any good, that's the important part, not how smart they are. I'm not going to believe them just on the basis that they're smart people. I know lots of smart people who couldn't tell me a thing about this.
And well, I'm not saying they're smart, but, scientists are usually very factual.
Right.
They're really not like, oh, this is God.
Yeah, that would be a dumb approach. But how do the bees get the pollen out? Whoa, this is God. Did you ever look at the back of your hand?
They take a look at something and they
Prove
do
it.
the facts.
Must remember this. Step 1 of sciencing. Do the facts.
And then if they're honest with themselves,
Right.
they present all the facts like in Lee Strobel Case for Christ, and there's overwhelming evidence.
I'm not. Commenters, go nuts.
There has to be
Eventually
a God
you gotta pick a
that
side.
does this, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it doesn't make sense that this just happens naturally.
Right.
What was the train of thought there? She mentioned, this is written by scientists who've put a lot of research into it, and then you went off on some tangent about how if you're honest with yourself as a scientist, then after you do the facts, you're gonna go, well, it must be God, because nothing else makes sense. Just like Lee Strobel, who's a smart science man. By the way, Lee Strobel is not a scientist. He was a newspaper journalist 40 years ago. Now he's just a standard issue apologist. Bro, you really need to back off and let your wife talk. God damn.
Yeah.
Kim, I know I might not be your favorite person right this second, but you agree with me in this particular case, don't you? You don't have to say it. I heard that, yep. I saw that look.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so
Back to the point, finally.
the Virginia Meadow Beauty is one of these flowers. It will not release its pollen unless buzzed by the bumblebee.
Buzzed.
Yeah, in that case, it's mainly bumblebees. There might be others. If there are, I don't know what they are. But yeah, mainly bumblebees in this case.
A honeybee can crawl around the flower all day and never get any pollen.
Yeah, by the way, you said this book was by scientists, but you never told me what book it is or who it's by.
Only the correct buzzing sound releases the pollen.
No, again, it's not the sound, it's the vibration. There are videos of people doing this on YouTube. If you look up like tuning fork pollination, electric toothbrush pollination, you can use that too. Works better if you take the plastic actual toothbrush end off, apparently. Just use the metal part that drives it. And yeah, I don't think it really matters which tuning fork you use, as long as it's not like way out of the Bumblebee range. I wouldn't make a 5000 hertz tuning fork my first choice. All else being equal, I would think that a 5000 hertz tuning fork would vibrate at a lower amplitude than like a 300 hertz one, wouldn't it? Which would not be helpful since amplitude seems like the most relevant factor. Unfortunately, I don't have any tomato plants going in the house right now, and if I did, who knows if they would be flowering. Otherwise, I probably would get various tuning forks and test this. But yeah, you can't just hold it near the flower and hope for the sound to do something. You're going to have to actually touch the plant, either at the back of the flower, or on the stem behind the flower, or on the anther itself. You have to vibrate the plant, and much harder than you're going to manage to accomplish just with the sound of a tuning fork somewhere nearby. And by the way, here's a video of a guy doing this with a detached anther. He takes his tuning fork, he touches it to the back of the tweezers with which he holds the anther, and the pollen comes out of the anther. Now, I highly doubt that the natural frequency of those tweezers is the same as the anther, and I also highly doubt that the natural frequency of the anther remains the same while it's being held with the tweezers. And yet, it works, because natural frequency is just not the primary thing in producing this effect.
That's just wild, isn't it?
I can imagine.
Yeah.
It's not really that wild, but I'm glad you're impressed.
In America, bumblebees are required for proper tomato flower pollination.
Okay.
These bumblebees make a buzzing sound at exactly middle C.
Yeah, I don't think that's true. I mean, that's going to vary with the bee. It's going to vary with the flower that it's on, how well it's working. I would imagine that at times it's at middle C, rarely exactly, and not for long if it is. This is really not that precise of a process.
I mean, it's just, to me,
C.
it's middle C.
Yeah.
It's not like
I'm not a
high
music
C or a low
person,
C.
but, yeah.
Neither am I, but
I don't know what that means, Jim. But it's true, a bumblebee's buzz pollination frequency will hit middle C, kind of on the middle lower end of the available range.
middle C. So it's like, when you find with God the perfect frequency.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a frequency.
So no other frequencies causes the pollen to be released from the tomato flower.
Yeah, I don't know where that's coming from. Your book, sure, I still don't know what your book is.
Honeybees work in silence, therefore no pollen is released from them.
That's a very odd way to state that. Honeybees don't buzz pollinate. That much is true. I really want to know what you're reading.
So Dr. Sarah Smith Greenleaf demonstrated this process with a tuning fork.
Oh, that's a
As I
good
stated
idea.
it out.
Right, okay.
Yeah, you can extract pollen with a tuning fork. Whack the tuning fork, touch the plant with it on the stem, on the flower. It doesn't really have to be that precise. As long as it's vibrating hard enough, the stuff should fall out.
And so when she struck a middle C and placed the tuning fork near the tomato flower, a cloud of yellow pollen appeared.
Wow.
I'm not sure what you're referring to. My guess is this. Biological conservation. Wild bee species increase tomato production and respond differently to surrounding land use in Northern California. November 2006. After the flowers had opened, we treated the artificial self-pollination group daily, sonicating each open flower with a middle C tuning fork to mimic floral sonication provided by bees. We vibrated the sonication-only flowers with a tuning fork. Artificially pollinated flowers had insect visitors excluded and were cross or self-pollinated by hand with the aid of a tuning fork. Same thing again here. And it doesn't mention tuning forks again. They're just sort of mentioning this in passing as a way to collect the pollen because this is a way people do that. It says nothing about holding the tuning fork near the flower. And yeah, it mentions that it's a middle C tuning fork, but just for completeness. Who is your book written by who's taking this to imply some kind of weird conclusion that it doesn't imply?
Only bumblebees buzz at the correct frequency to unlock the pollen.
Wow.
I still don't understand what's supporting this idea that the frequency of the bee's vibration is what matters, that it's at the natural frequency of the stamen. Nothing you've said here supports or establishes that, so where's that coming from? What is the book? Well, I found this blog post saying all of the exact same stuff that Kim is saying, and apparently when they say exactly middle C, they mean exactly 261.63 hertz, apparently. That doesn't sound true at all. At the bottom, you have a quote, "All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made." John 1:3. Below which it says, "This blog post is quoted with permission from the book Have You Considered? By Julie Van Vet and Bruce Malone. This book is an excellent creation science resource and is packed with compelling evidence that challenges and refutes evolution theories." And then it has a link that goes to here, the Alpha Omega Institute. I don't know if these people have anything to do with the book itself. I kind of don't think so. This book is sold all over the place. Here's the preview on Creation Today, where it's also being sold. You can see it's definitely the right book. It has those green lines at the top with the green circles. And yes, as I expected, this book is written as if for children. Imagine an anthill made out of pine needles 7 feet high. That's what you can find in Northern Europe and cold Siberia. It's everything I thought it might be and creationist drivel on top. Here's the back cover. Are your beliefs true beyond a reasonable doubt? For over 200 years, the American judicial system has upheld a standard so strong that a person's very life can be ended based on this level of confidence. It is a verdict supported by evidence that is beyond a reasonable doubt. This book is the third in a series of unique devotions, presenting evidence for every day of the year that demonstrates it is beyond any reasonable doubt that we have a creator. This is the evidence most people are woefully unaware of, because it has been censored from scientific educational consideration. Oh, is that why that nasty scientist Mario said that bumblebees don't vibrate at exactly middle C, 261.63 hertz all the time? That Satan-loving bastard! So I looked up these two people. Julie Van Vet has been teaching creation science and worldview since 2003 to homeschoolers and doing seminars at churches and community events. She literally has 500 students all over the state of Minnesota. Prior to this, Julie home-educated her children through high school. After attending worldview classes at Summit Ministries in 1992, she began teaching year-long worldview classes to high school students and parents. She realized that the foundation of a biblical worldview begins with creation, Genesis 1 through 11. Julie has received her BA from St. Olaf College, presumably in the science of sciencing. She lives with husband Vince in Minnesota. In their free time, they love to travel out west and explore the geology from a creationist perspective and dig dinosaurs. That doesn't sound much like science, frankly, the way it's presented. Sounds more like vandalism. Bruce Malone has spent almost 30 years bringing the scientific evidence for creation to churches and colleges at seminars throughout the United States and many foreign countries. He has authored 6 books on the evidence for creation with over 250,000 copies in print, served as adjunct speaker for the Institute for Creation Research, go figure, is an associate speaker for Logos Research Associates Incorporated, and is a commissioned worldview speaker under Chuck Colson's Centurion program, bringing a recent biblical creation understanding to worldview issues. Bruce has 27 years of research experience with the Dow Chemical Corporation, but left in 2008 to serve as executive director of Search for the Truth Ministries, with the vision of awakening hearts and minds to biblical truth. This organization widely distributes Bible-affirming creation materials to students and prisoners. Bruce has a BS degree in chemical engineering from the University of Cincinnati and holds 17 patents for new products with the Dow Chemical Corporation. Wow, that's almost as scientific as chemist, scientist, auto technician, mid-husband John Morris Pendleton.
So we would like to know what you guys, we accept everybody, right? So whether you're an atheist, agnostic, you don't believe in God, we would like to know what you think about this.
Okay, well, I'm happy to oblige. I hope I've provided some sort of insight here. At least into the fact that there might be more to the picture than what's being presented by Bruce and Julie. But the real problem is you're not coming at this with an interest in bees, or pollination, or plants, or anything. And so, of course, you're not going to worry about little details like whether the details about the bees and the plants are actually true. That's a side issue. Why bother spending time learning about that? That's not as important as God. I'm not saying that just to insult you. I'm trying to encourage some curiosity. It's actually fun. Try it. Alright, well, I think that's about all I got to say about that one, so thank you everyone for watching. If you would, before you go, please do give the video a like and click subscribe if you haven't, and if you like the channel, maybe consider supporting. A few bucks a month is enormously helpful, and huge thanks to all of my supporters who've already made that choice. Early access, email list, list.logicked.com, and I'll see you next time.